mind to tell us what have you seen and how do you feel about this?
Yesterday.
I saw two things yesterday. There were three things. I saw violent protests in the morning at the flag raising. I was actually behind the police lines watching the sea of faces, mindless faces with goggles, face masks, caps, everything, just to hide their identity. I don't hide my identity. I walk around. I'm a free person in Hong Kong. Then I marched with everyone in the afternoon, which was again a peaceful march, just like 2 or 3 Sundays before. Not so many, but peaceful people. Then I went back and watched the violence last night, the vandalism, the disgusting things you see here, and I just cried. I lived in Hong Kong more than half my life. I love Hong Kong, I love China. But I know that these things have set back the progress of peaceful evolution of democracy in Hong Kong by at least 2 or 3 generations, and in China by 4 or 5 generations. This is the saddest thing. These protesters may have thought that they were doing something good, but I think most of them were just thugs and vandals out to have a fight with the police, most of them. But what they've done is immense damage to 1/4 of the world's population, and this is the saddest thing of all. It's a tragedy, what you see behind me.
What do you think for the young generation, especially for young kids, they're worried about their future? Do you think they have a right to do that?
They have a right to protest, they have a right to vote, but they don't have a right to violence. And Hong Kong is built on the law, the rule of law, and not chaos. And no one has the right to do this kind of thing. If I came into your home and started to smash up your home, beat up your home and break all your precious things, and then but go away and say, very sorry, I just felt badly about you. Would I have that right? No, I don't have that right. No one has that right. And if these protesters last night had faced riot police in a Western democracy like England or America or France or Germany, there would have been real bullets, not rubber bullets. Tens or even hundreds of people would have been killed and injured. Hong Kong is a free place. There's almost nothing you can't do in Hong Kong. And this is the tragedy. The young people don't understand this. They don't realize how good life really is in Hong Kong. We are a free place. And most parts of China is also free. This is the tragedy, and the West doesn't understand it.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, you're welcome.
This lady who's been doing some great reporting for us, we're going to join her now. All this week, the world has been focusing on Hong Kong, right? And you know, to hear most of these reports from networks like, especially the BBC. I spent hours yesterday watching the BBC as most of these reports were being filed. What you get when you watch the BBC is that the entire problem in Hong Kong is placed squarely on Beijing. They're 100% at fault. In fact, here, let's go to them.
Fortunately, I think that if it's been breaking down, it's because of the behavior of the government in Beijing under Xi Jinping. They've been involving themselves far more in Hong Kong's affairs.
Predictable, right? It's all China's fault. Completely China's fault. Look, it's not to say China's a perfect nation. They obviously have their problems. Who knows what they're doing? But it immediately got us to thinking when you have such an absolutist response like we just heard right there. Is it really all Beijing's fault? The more we looked into this, the more we found that the UK's hands, they're really not so clean. You know what I mean? Joining us now is NRS correspondent Michelle Greenstein, who's been looking into this. And once again, hey, lady, what did you find? It's an old Jerry. It's too young for you. You wouldn't remember, but it's a great line from the past.
I'll take your word for it.
What did you find?
So firstly, that sound that we just listened to is part of a BBC segment that was 10 minutes long on the protests in Hong Kong. The man that we just heard speak was actually the governor of Hong Kong under British colonial rule. He was the last British governor of Hong Kong. He was governor until 1997, until the handover from Britain back to China. So interesting that that's the expert they chose to give a voice to. Now let's talk about these protests, because the BBC is not alone. A lot of Western corporate press have been leaving out important history and important context. So these protests appear to have started in response to a proposed bill that would amend existing extradition law where only for places where there's no existing extradition treaty. So it would allow Hong Kong to surrender fugitives on a case-by-case basis. It wouldn't compel them, it wouldn't disallow them, but it would allow them to on a case-by-case basis to countries with no treaty with Hong Kong, including China. But the question we have to ask is, why does Hong Kong have its own legal system and its own extradition treaties? There's no other city in the world that has its own extradition law. And the answer to that is because Hong Kong Basic Law, which is what it's called, is based on the British and Chinese joint agreement to hand Hong Kong over back from Britain to China. The return of Hong Kong to China was predicated on China agreeing to these British terms. So this is why we have to talk about the history that's missing from a lot of these BBC reports.
Which is a dirty, nasty, ugly history, by the way.
Absolutely. And that's the reason why we have this one country, two systems rule, because the colony was returned back to China under this principle, and in that they kept much of this old colonial legal system that existed under Britain. But if Britain hadn't occupied Hong Kong, it wouldn't have its own independent legal system. But let's talk about that dirty, nasty history, because Britain and China, as we know, were involved in a war, basically the Opium War, as we call it. The British essentially imposed opium on the Chinese population, essentially drugging an entire nation for profit. And in some cities, Rick, up to 80% of the men were hooked on this drug, and even large numbers of children were consuming it as well. So this is a history we can't forget when we're talking about what's happening.
It's like the opioid epidemic we're having here in this country, but times 20 or 30, right?
Absolutely. And this drug was produced and transported by Britain intentionally. So the reason this war ended with Hong Kong being given to Britain is because Britain invaded China and occupied Hong Kong, essentially in retaliation for the Chinese government destroying 20,000 chests of opium, because weirdly enough, they didn't want the Chinese people drugged on opium. It's a really interesting part of their culture.
They would want to do that.
That's right.
Yeah.
So China was actually forced to give Hong Kong back to the British after being defeated militarily by the British, and that's why we saw Hong Kong being returned to China in 1997. So these British handover terms, interestingly enough, didn't include voting rights. They didn't include anything about democracy, but what they did protect was private property rights, which is why it's very ironic for a lot of the Western corporate press, including the BBC, although the BBC is not alone, to be hailing themselves as beacons of democracy and saying, oh, we care so much about democracy in Hong Kong, when the Hong Konger, under British colonial rule, had no voting rights at all.
So in actuality, they actually perpetrated some pretty bad democracy.
That's right.
While saying now that they are the beacons of democracy.
That's right. And it's convenient to use this pretext of human rights, of democracy, to vilify China, because we know the West is very heavily invested in dividing and weakening China right now.
That's a great story. Thanks for sharing it.
It's a sad one, but yes.
And it's one nobody heard this week while they were watching all these protests in Hong Kong.
No mention of the opium wars.
Oh
it's
my
wild.
God, what a coincidence. How bizarre. Right?
Yeah.
Nice job.
Thank you.